Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Aryan Malik. I am currently a nursing student. This is Study With Me series. Today is day 19. We'll be continuing our discussion on fundamentals of nursing and we'll be talking about ethical principles, particularly tort law. So, it is a combination of wrongful acts or violation of rights that can lead to legal liabilities. For example, the situation wherein a patient was a client was put in forceful restraints or anything where a healthcare provider has caused some harm to the patient, and here the burden of proof lies with the accuser, not the accused. Now let's look into unintentional thoughts, something which is not intentional but happened by mistake. So it's unintended accidents that cause harm, injury, property damage, or financial loss. And the main kind of point that comes into this is of negligence. It's the failure to provide adequate care that another reasonable, prudent co worker would do in a similar situation. So, say I and another person is a registered nurse, and I was unable to provide the same care that the other nurse would have provided, and it will be termed as negligence on my part. It is a practice that is below standard of care, and nurses, for example, nurse that did not wash their hand prior to inserting a Foley catheter, increasing the risk of infection to the patient. And a nurse identifies the absence of peripheral pulse in a client's castrate extremity in the early morning, but does not report it till the early afternoon, which is again a negligence on the nurse part. If informed consent is withheld from a client, healthcare providers could be found guilty of negligence. It is really important to receive informed consent. Maybe it's before any procedure or any important thing that the client should be informed about. Informed consent is always important in terms of receiving it from the client. The next important key term when it comes to unintentional torts is malpractice. It's basically illegal, improper, or negligent actions by a licensed professional, or maybe it's an RN, LPN, or a doctor. An example of malpractice is that the RN failed to check the dosage on a medication while which in turn lead to harmful effects on the client. Another key concept in unintentional thoughts, or another example of it, is abandonment. It's basically desertion of a client when by anyone who has assumed the responsibility of a care. Say a registered nurse comes to you and they say that you have been assigned this client, it is your responsibility. Now the patient falls under your responsibility of care, so you should either assign it to the other nurse or you should assume the responsibility. You should not leave the patient alone and go to your home. Now, let's look at some intentional thoughts. These are basically the willful acts that violate a client's rights. And I use the simple nursing way of remembering this, which is A and B. A stands for assault, a threat to the client, before battery. Battery means harm, any harm that the client has faced. So let's look upon assault. It's the threat of harm, any threat that is made toward a client. Let's look at an example. I will restrain you to the bed if you keep getting up. Threatening to place a nasogastric tube in a client who's refusing to eat. It is really important to understand that as a registered nurse, you need to you cannot impose something on the client. You need to make them comfortable and provide the care that takes it in account of their comfort measures. Now, battery, it is actually the act of harm where a healthcare provider harms the patient. So it is a physical act that causes harm or unconsenting contact that causes harm. So, for example, performing a procedure without consent, in receiving informed consent before a procedure is really, really important. A procedure cannot go through if the informed consent is not there. And most of the times, I think all of the time, it is your responsibility as a registered nurse to make sure that informed consent is signed and understood by the client. Another example is giving a medication that the client refuses. Now, let's look at a combined example wherein assault and battery both were used, meaning the threat as well as the harm were caused, chemically restraining a patient who is competent and able to make decisions. So here we see that we restrain them, which is an example of threat, and it's actually causing them harm, which is they are able to make decisions, but still we are imposing on them, which is not right. Another example or a type of intentional tort is false imprisonment, using physical restraints, seclusions, or a chemical restraints to keep someone against their will. Keep in mind, this does not include clients that are on a psychotic or a suicide hold. For example, using restraints on a competent client to prevent their leaving the healthcare facility. So, the important concept here is that if a client is not on suicide prevention, or if they are not on a suicide prevention and they are not on any psychotic drug and they want to leave, they can leave against the medical advice. I'll repeat myself. If a client is on a suicide hold and if they are on a psychotic drug, either or, they cannot leave the facility. But if they are not under any one of these, they are allowed to leave against medical advice. The next important term is invasion of privacy, which is again an intentional tort, violating confidentiality rights. For example, HIPAA violation. It can be like telling the family members about a client's condition or the diagnosis without receiving prior consent from the client. We should not tell family members before we have discussed it with the client if they're comfortable in sharing their status or their plan of care or anything that entails to the client's treatment plan. We should always receive their consent before sharing it with anyone. Anyone in terms of someone who's not directly related with the treatment plan. Of course, the healthcare provider and the nurses who are working with the client, they are supposed to know, but anyone from the family or from the outside, they should not know without consent. Next is defamation of character, and it is making rude, insulting remarks that harm a client's reputation, either written or verbal. So, written is libel. So, any written kind of defamation wherein someone had made rude or insulting remarks is referred to as libel, while spoken defamation is referred to as slander. For example, break room gossip. And an example of libel can be, I think a long time ago, wherein healthcare, which was not intentionally, though I should mention this, the healthcare provider did not do it intentionally, but while writing the diagnosis of a client, they mentioned in the report that the client has BS, which actually translates for Johnston syndrome, which is an example of a genetic disease. But because they wrote BS and client somehow read that, he thought that the provider called the client a BS, and they actually sued the the healthcare provider for defamation. So it's a big thing. So please remember this while you are working in the practice, to not intentionally or unintentionally make written or verbal defamatory remarks against anyone. Now, let's look at a question to better understand the concept. Two nurses are sitting in the lounge and they hear a co worker state that she believes a married healthcare provider is involved in a relationship with a client. This would be an example of slander, spoken defamation. We can't speak gossip, it can lead to legal trouble. Let's look at another example or a question. My apologies. A nurse applies restraints without a prescription. The client who threatens to leave against medical advice. What are some of the intentional thoughts that the nurse could be charged with here? Select all that apply. Malpractice, no, it is not applied to the question. Negligence, again, no, it is not applied to the question. Battery, yes, restraints were applied, so the threat was there, and basically the client was beaten up in a way. So it's a combination of threat and causing harm. Then false imprisonment, yes, they are keeping a client against their will. The client does not have any prescription for any psychotic drugs, nor they are on a suicide watch, so they should be allowed to leave against medical advice, but they did not. The registered nurse did not let them, so it will be false imprisonment. And the last option was HIPAA. There is no discussion of privacy or invasion of privacy, so it is not violated here. Now, two other things which are important when it comes to ethics is remembering ANA, which is American Nurses Association. They have established the ethical standards for the nursing profession, and that is what is followed across the healthcare systems in United States. And there is something called the ethics committee. It's a healthcare team that provides guidance in the face of an ethical dilemma. They provide recommendation and they do not impose decisions. The last important key term is standards of practice. The reasonable nurse test is basically used to determine a standard of care. There are some questions asked like, what would a prudent nurse do in the same circumstance, and what would a similar nurse in the same area with the same training and background do? I hope you found this video helpful. Please stay tuned for more videos that will be coming out in the future. Thanks for watching.